right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast. I almost screwed it up.
Almost.
With Tommy, Seth, and Mike.
Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday.
Good job.
So for those of you who are joining online, we will be likely all across the world. I'll be traveling to another conference during this as we're speaking. So I'll be moving somewhere. So this session is a pre-recorded session. Just be aware. Sorry, it may not be as awesome as ever. It might also be a little bit shorter too, because we're trying to cram these in before everyone's got to travel across the world.
It will be shorter, so just prepare yourselves to
have a shortened episode. We're still giving content. It's just going to be a bit shorter.
We've given you 145 hours of content.
Wow.
You can afford 30 minutes.
You can afford 30 minutes.
I think of those 145, we also promised that they were going to be a half hour, actually. So
that's true.
It's just us coming back to our clearly stated goals from the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. I'm still on a high from the Data Insight Summit. I mean, it's just super fun. I'm so excited to get back to real events. I'm just jazzed to all to the nth degree, man. I'm just loving it. The Twitter feedback on the output of the event, people are saying they loved it. It was good, and like there's just a lot of like, I think people missed it. I think people missed the community. Anyways, this is probably boding very well for user group events in person at some point in time. With these kind of shorter episodes, we decided to take it a little bit of a different direction here for a bit. We're going to go and do some of the mailbag. So these are questions from the community. We're going to kind of dive in and talk about these topics, and we'll just do kind of a short session around direct questions coming back in from the mailbag. So first thing we noticed is we apologize. The mailbag has nowhere to put your email or your name. Or we don't know who you are. So thank you for your comments, but we don't know who you are. So hopefully you're a regular listener, because we're going to answer your question, and maybe you can tell us if this is your question or not.
All the mailbags should have like a dash, like put your dash name.
Yeah. Or you just have a name field in there. I'll just add a name field to it.
Anonymous, right? Don't allow anonymous.
Hip hop anonymous.
Create it. You have to at least come up with a creative name.
Rhymes with bottomless and then hip hop anonymous.
Anonymous. Yeah.
All right. Let's jump into this mailbag question. So the question comes from Anonymous. At this point in time in our ETL process, does it make sense to have a change database column names to business friendly names? I probably read that a little bit funny. So I guess really the gist here is when we're loading data from the SQL Server side, and then we're bringing that data into Power BI, when is the appropriate name change? Do you use the underscore and the syntax of that other server on the back end? And where in the ETL process do we think that should live? Should it all be done? Should it all be done a part of the ETL process before you touch it in Power BI, or should it be done in Power BI after you bring it into the ETL process?
You're saying get rid of the
database centric names.
Right? Yeah. Into business friendly names.
Correct. That's what I'm trying to articulate. It's been a long day already.
I really wanted to read it in like a radio voice.
You want to read it?
Can I?
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Do it.
Okay.
Always got to do the
voice. This is where it's a challenge not knowing, who submitted. But anyway, I digress.
Morning radio or NPR?
Dear Mike, Tommy, and Seth, I just added that. At what point in the ETL to Power BI process does it make sense to change the database column names into business-friendly names? Should it be part of the ETL process at all? Or should it only be done in reporting cubes? My thought is to keep it at the end of the ETL process and document the name change. That allows all reports to use the same business name versus renaming columns every time a report is stood up. What do you guys think?
I'd like it.
Colin.
That's a thank you for calling in.
Thanks for calling in to the Explicit Measures podcast.
Okay, it's good. I like it. You read it way better than I read it. That's for sure. I'm never reading them again. I'm gonna throw this all to Seth from now on.
Yes,
killed it.
New names for each one too, or new voices.
It's funny with this one because he's saying when do you do it, and I think when we first read it, it's like how much do you do of it, and especially with Power BI, like if you're gonna rename it all in Power Query, if you're gonna obviously that's usually the point you would do it in, like right when you connect to the source. It's probably not going to be in the database that you're going to have that friendly name. But I mean, if anyone's renamed columns before, you know what dependencies live on that. There's no like column ID. So trying to figure out like, oh, did I rename something? Then you have to change the order. Or, like anything you've done, it makes it a headache. That being said, the fact that what marginal difference does it do for having the friendly names, because that's what ultimately is displayed?
I think that this is a really good question, because on one hand, you want to carry the database names through as far as possible as you can for the data engineering. The data engineering team is trying to figure out what names of columns went where. So if you're trying to lineage your way through and figure out what is the source system, and you're looking at that in a different computer, like, you lose context of what that name is if you stick it in like a SQL view, right? So here's what I'm thinking, right? There's like data in a system somewhere, and there's a SQL view, and then you do the as statement to rename the columns, and so now you can then make your prettier names. You can take away the spaces and the underscores, and you make it what that business language is. And I like that. I think I'm leaning more towards I've always been create a view to be consumed in Power BI. So I very rarely recommend people to directly connect to tables, and instead use a view for this very reason. If you have to retool a name or a column name, it's a lot less labor for you to use the view as opposed to going back to the source system or the source table and changing a column name there. Would you agree, Seth?
Yes.
Good. And then my second point will be...
All right.
No, I'm just teasing.
No, absolutely. So if as our mailbag person is saying their thought is to keep it at the end of the ETL process and document the name change, I think that's a good idea.
I agree.
Because two different points, right? The source systems and tables typically are named and designed in such a way for easy querying, right? Like, or
easy to write the name,
correlation between the different tables, right?
Yep.
Within the core structure. As those change, though, and in views, you could be consolidating, coalescing, like doing additional business logic on top of source system stuff, right? So the view is that, or the end of the ETL process, right? Where you're going to pass it off into the reports, I think is a fantastic spot, because it consolidates all of the conversation around like, oh, okay, I'm seeing this thing in this report. How do I bring that lineage back through the model into this, location where data is going into the reporting? And another way is like, typically your data warehousing is going to have more business friendly names, I would argue, than source core systems.
Hold on.
Or actually, is it?
I don't know. Well, so here I'm thinking about this now. So, right, if we're talking about maturing data throughout this pipeline, right? If you're going to ever give access,
you're going to have like WID W underscore, like that's going to be its own core system. So
See Dataverse.
Well, here's what I'm thinking though. Like, if we're thinking about like access to data in the data system as a platform, right? We have the enterprise data warehouse, and we have the reports and the models, right? So the models are like a cache of the data, and then you have the report rendering from the cache, basically. If you think about that, well, at some point in time, you're probably going to want your business users or some analysts to start hitting your gold tables or your final mature tables and maybe doing their own analysis on that. So this is, that last layer of the data lake, if you're building those things, or your last layer of data transformations, there may be some team members that are getting direct access to that SQL layer at the end there. So, in that case, you're having this disconnect between the data engineering team and like, potential some sharp business users that you're giving access to data at a more, behind the walls of Power BI. You need to, I'm thinking trying to keep it consistent a bit, right? So I'm thinking the view is a good place. So let me say this. A view is a great place when you're connecting to like a structured data system, like a SQL server, and you're just trying to get access to stuff and get it out the door. I think that's a good solution. But I think when we start talking about where and what audiences are going to consume data, you might need to pull those names a little bit further up into like that final layer of, table underscore final tables, the final table that's right before you load it. You may want to pull those business names in there as well, because business users are going to touch that area. So, I definitely would not put the names. I wouldn't rename the columns in Power Query.
Yeah.
I would not recommend that.
Well, congratulations. You've solved one data source in Power BI out of 200. So, and you're also assuming you can.
What do you mean? You're pulling
views.
data from anywhere else other than the data lake? What are you talking about? You're full of bananas.
Brother, let me introduce.
Just
Have you not opened another person's report before?
Maxim's Roach. I mean, Roach is Maxim, right?
Yeah.
Transform your data as upstream as possible and as little downstream
that is
as
right.
necessary.
Yes.
You're right.
I'm going to genericize my answer even further, right? Like we were saying views, it's very database specific, right?
Correct.
Like if you can have a final layer to consolidate as much as you can from going from unfriendly to friendly names, do it there, right? Before you get in, like, don't, as much as possible, avoid trying to change names in the very front end because you're just going to create more problems for yourself.
And I agree, but there's 2 points that, like, again, not everyone has that ability to create the views.
That's why I genericized my answer.
Okay,
for you.
Continue. Go
specifically for you.
Oh,
proceed, Tommy.
So nice. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tommy. Go ahead.
That's all I got, man. Come on.
Oh, I thought you said something for me.
No.
Okay. Oh, there's nothing for me. Okay.
Can I call you Tom? Tom?
No,
Tom,
absolutely not.
Tom,
no.
Tom
That's the end of the podcast right here. Nope.
I like where you're going with this though, but I'm okay. Yeah. I want to tease Tommy's idea. I think I know where you're going with this, Tommy.
No, I want to hear Tommy's idea first.
I do. Okay, you say it, and then I'll interpret what it really meant.
I'm pretty lost in thought right now because I thought Seth was going to talk, but
no.
Well, you were starting to talk about different sources in the Power BI file and how needed those are. So finish that thought out.
So we're dealing with SQL, and you're assuming that the developer in Power BI can create a view at will, right, and be able to update that. So that was the first thought because that's 1 out of 200. You're still dealing with Java, or APIs or SharePoint or Excel or ODBC or
great. Get past that.
Sure. So that's not possible with the views.
Yep.
So that's probably half the time we're going to be having to rename it or make friendly names, and that place would be Power Query.
So I would agree with that from the standpoint that if you are building a Power BI report and you're doing it's not even Wild West. You're connecting to multiple different data sources. This is how you build your ingestion and ETL. Then I would argue that yes, it would make more sense to do the transformation of names in Power Query than load that into a model, because that's going to be a data set that then you would extrapolate and continue to change naming in reports and visuals and stuff like that. How about this? The worst place to do it is on the visual level in every report, because
100%.
You're gonna have problems trying to understand like what the thing is if it's not named exactly the same way. And the reason, like, what does this ultimately solve? Like, why are we having this conversation? Because
seen it all the time.
It happens. But it's if you don't do that, and it's not the nomenclature is not the same. Every single time somebody has a question, you're going to have to go trace it back all the way through
all the time,
every single time.
And while you can rename a column in the visual layer, like you can drag the column over, you can rename it. You have to, in order to get back to what the column name really was in the data model, you have to hover the item and then wait until the column names expose itself. So there's really no way of just saying these visuals, these columns done, unless you're using an advanced tool like Field Finder or Umkey's tool to document the Power BI tool, Power BI Cleaner, right? Field Cleaner, right? These are other tools that you can use to help you find data fields and link them to files. I want to point out another point here that I think is where maybe part of this question is coming from is they're saying here, I want to focus on the last statement. My thought is to keep the changes at the end of the ETL process, and this allows all reports to use the same business name versus renaming. Now, this sounds to me like this is a report and model combined into one file, is what this is sounding to me. As soon as you remove that one report to one file mentality and start thinking about common data models and reusable content and building thin reports and models as a separate entity, I think this story changes to me a little bit, right? I can allow a little bit more flexibility to what you're speaking to, Tommy. Let the data come in from these various sources, Excel, ODBC, SharePoint, whatever, rename those columns in the common data set, and then those are automatically propagated to all the reports. So their business. So it kind of, to me, it depends on like what is the audience of who's consuming this content or creating content on top of stuff, right? If I have a modeler who's going to build some data models and everyone's going to consume from that single model, then I think it's okay to retain those naming conventions and adjusting those naming conventions at the model level. If your report consumers, and that's to meet the needs of the report author layer, right? If I'm going to now meet the needs of multiple modelers using the same business logic, that if that's my audience, then I've got to push those naming things upstream. Now and I would also potentially argue here, if you're doing like some of these other data sources, maybe ODBC is not the best, but you could rename stuff in Excel before it comes to Power BI. You could rename stuff in SharePoint to some degree so that the column names of what the table you're bringing in is correct. So I also don't love those as data sources for things that I'm trying to build. Like I'm trying to get rid of those sources if we can help it.
Yeah, I'm trying to get rid of taxes too, but it's not going to happen. But I think the biggest thing though too, I mean, trust IRS. No, I'm paying. Don't worry. Don't worry.
Hey, IRS, you didn't hear this.
We're good. We're good.
You
We're
just
good.
reminded me.
We're good. Time to pay. But I think that, so I think there lies a kind of a question, especially when you're dealing with the query editor, when you don't have some of those systems. Of course, the ideal state is everything before it gets to Power BI has the right name. But I think there's two parts here. There's unified names, and I think the friendly names, and where do we do it in our transformations in Power BI? So it's kind of it depends question, but do you rename everything from the onset? Like if you load data, first step is rename everything, then the transformations.
Ooh, in Power Query?
Yeah, in Power Query, is it at the very end?
Always at the end.
Always at the end?
I do.
Yeah.
What do you do it?
Is any of your shifting around that you do in between steps?
That's the worst thing to do.
No, I'm not saying interject naming changes, right? But if you don't do all the name change at the end, if you go back and refactor something, like
stuff seems to break more frequently.
It all.
Yeah,
I think I think it could be it could be
apart.
personal preference, but from a performance standpoint, when you load data into a Power Query, the first thing you should be doing is figuring out how to cut that data. If the source is foldable, add a filter. Filter the number of columns, filter the number of rows. The first thing you can do is if you can cut as much data out of that first step as possible, and if that step query folds back to the source system, you're going to be in a much better place than just loading all the data in and then renaming it immediately. Because that's going to be a lot of extra load. Yeah. You have to load the whole table.
What's the difference between like cleaning, like getting rid of all of the data that you want to, which is, makes sense. What's the difference between renaming right away and then doing a bunch of stuff, or doing it at the end?
There's situations where you have appends that you need to do and then load the data. So some may have it at the end, some you may do it before and do a lot of transformations. Honestly, I agree. I think it should try to be at the end as much as possible, because you do not want to deal with that headache of like, I reordered everything, I have to remove that, or I select columns and it's based on the name. So totally. I agree with that, but I think there's a bigger question here for me.
Okay.
How friendly are we talking about here? Right? When we're talking
smiley faces and rocket ships. That's what I'm thinking.
I mean, emojis in your column.
Unicorns and rainbows.
Sales, total sales has a rocket ship before it.
Oh yeah, now we're talking.
Yeah. But I think everywhere. Because, and I think I struggle with
customer feedback has a little throw up icon.
Yeah. but I mean, this goes back to like, when we think friendly, usually we're like camel case. That's easy. But I think we're, from the developer point of view, but I agree, Seth. Like friendly is obviously something think of a website, not necessarily like the div ID, but the actual display.
How you want to see it in a report.
Right? How you want to see a report.
But that's also changes over time, I would say too, right? So if you leave the last step in your report to be rename columns, and one thing they don't have in Power Query, which would be nice, we should go add this to the ideas.com, is like if there's two steps side by side, rename columns 1, rename columns 2, you should be able to merge those. You should be able to merge. Right.
You know what else they should add? They should add that as part of the theme file, right? Like give us your list of columns and we'll create a mapping, and then wherever you see this, replace it.
There are transformations to do so. but it ain't fun.
I don't know if I'd want to spend the time to do that.
Ain't worth it.
I've tried to build some more complex things around data cleansing inside Power Query, where you have like, hey, I have an interchange of values that I'm going to replace, and then anytime these replacements show up, replace them in the data set. That's more like cleaning data than anything else.
No, I mean, honestly, that is one of the cooler features you would never know is available in Power Query. Like we had like 3 different sources we all had to pen together, and they all had 50 columns initially. That a lot of transformations need to be done before it could even get to Power BI. So with data flows, we basically had this function that would go through each column dynamically. And I think the unified naming, the other thing we talked about was the documentation, right? Where like if you're going to rename something in relation to what, but I think for me, the biggest thing is, and we didn't talk about it too much, but how friendly are we talking about and the pros and cons of that? I still think there's a compromise between the developer name and the friendly name for Power BI.
At the end of the day, though, I think you're going to, I'm not sure. I'm not sure when I'm modeling data in Power Query, I know exactly how every column should be named inside the final report.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like sometimes that naming slightly adjusts itself on things, potentially. So, I mean, I think you can get away with some certain names of columns, product, customer. Like there's some kind of common ones you could probably just, everyone would agree to. But I'd also, like, again, keeping that rename step at the bottom of the Power Query, you can go in the report and just rename columns as needed in the report as you're building so that they are friendly. And then then you can go back to Power Query and kind of like merge those last 2 steps together, or whatever steps are created when you're renaming things, so it's just one complete step at the end of the report. Let's do some final thoughts here. Final thoughts. All right, Tommy, we're going to wrap this one pretty quick, and then we'll jump into our next recorded episode.
Our next one. Yeah, if only vacation was at the end of this, it's just more work.
It's just more work.
No,
final thoughts. What are you thinking? What are the key takeaways for you?
I think the key takeaways, we're going to probably have like 3 more conversations from this, honestly. But like, I think this is a struggle, because when you have spaces and it's really friendly, it's so frustrating to work in Power BI because it's usually too long, right? Friendly name is usually descriptive in some way. So then it doesn't fit. We didn't even talk about the display side, like, our member counts or SAP or something like that, where that it doesn't fit in a column or a bar chart. So I am all a proponent of, when we talk about documentation, it's not just for the internal team. It's very focused too on having a lexicon at the company where you do have, in a sense, company slang for certain things, and it can be somewhere that can live universally. So you can have those, in a sense, acronyms, so to speak. It makes it easy for the developer, but it's also a little legible. You have a legend on your reference page in your report to say, hey, ENO equals this, so to speak, just so you know. So we don't have to spell out everything. And also, again, for us to actually be productive in Power BI and not to make errors.
Seth, your kind of final thoughts? Where do you land on some of this question?
I agree with our friendly caller. Put it like, if your code matches up to some documentation as best as possible, right? Where I have a mapping of this raw like backend field maps to this, and there might be some variance in some reports, right? Maybe that's the okay. Sometimes we're okay with adjusting. I think overall that's typically where I try to do the swap over rather than keeping it way in the front end, because that just creates more time to build reports, because everybody's got to go change the names every single time.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It just creates more of a hassle to track down, like, oh, I forgot, I have to go revisit where the lineage goes.
So a couple final thoughts. I know you can't have all data sources coming from a lakehouse something somewhere, but it's getting easier and easier to do so, either through data flows. There's other stuff coming to the technology stack that's going to make it easier for you to get those other sources and drop them into a common location. I think this is becoming a better practice, and we should start utilizing data flows, the data mart. That's the place where you're going to land data, and then you can whip out views on top of it that then help you with this naming schema thing. I think you want to think about your audience, right? Is your audience going to consume data directly from your data tables, the back end? And are you going to consume things from a model and thin report solution? or are you going to consume things out of report and model combined solution? I think if you think about your audience, again, you want to be able to have those user-friendly names as early as possible, I think, for whatever that audience is going to be doing. So I think in certain use cases, if the data is going to be touched by the business users back in what I would call the gold layer of data in your lake, yeah, put the names there and then pull them forward through your view and then pull them forward through your Power BI data model. I would not recommend, of the spectrum of things I would do, the thing I would not recommend the most on the don't do would be, if you can avoid it, try to not rename columns inside visuals unless you just have to have it done. So that's just, yeah, I would prefer to avoid that if at all possible. All right, with that, we give you a little episode. Thank you very much for listening. We answered our quick mailbag question. We'll have another one on Thursday this week. Another quick mailbag. We're going to do a quick session while people are traveling for conferences and things. And then we'll be back with some longer episodes as we come up with some good topics and talk more about future things. Anyways, our only ask for you to hang out with the podcast is, if you like this content, if you like what we're doing here, if you want a question answered, frankly, submit a question to the mailbag. It's at Power BI Tips/podcast. You can go down there. There's a form at the bottom of the page. Fill out your question. Let us know what you think about the podcast. And if you have a question, and maybe we'll get around to answering that as well. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
If you missed a lot of us this week, party like it's the 90s. Go back to the episodes in the 90s. We actually had some pretty good ones there. So if you missed them, so
I like the 80s.
Not 90s, yeah. The year, not the year.
No, the episode. Yeah.
Episode 90.
You're so much younger then.
Oh, man.
But if you like everything, subscribe. You can find all the episodes. They're still relevant. It's not like we're talking about why use Excel in episode 90. Wasn't that long ago. And make sure to share, spread the word. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.